James Joyce's 1922 novel, Ulysses, has been termed many things. While eventually heralded as a demonstration and summation of the entire movement of modernism, and called the most prominent landmark in modern literature, Ulysses has by no means had an easy time in the literary house of criticism. Joyce's contemporaries and modern readers alike have criticized the wandering narrative that follows an unremarkable protagonist, as well as the unorthodox elements included in the story. Having been banned for obscenity until the 1930s, Ulysses generally creates two camps of response. One that dismisses the work as enigmatic at best and pornographic at worst, as we can see through Carl Jung's response. Thoroughly hopeless emptiness is the dominant note of the whole book. It not only begins and ends in nothingness, but it consists of nothing but nothingness. It is all infernally nugatory. The second camp considers it a literary masterpiece, as we see in Dr. Collins' praise here. Ulysses is the most important contribution that has been made to fictional literature in the 20th century. It will immortalize its author with the same certainty that Gargantua and Pantagruel immortalized Rabelais and the brothers Karamazov of Dostoevsky. Joyce modeled the structure as well as many particular components of his work after Homer's epic poem, Odyssey, even providing two different schemas after publication that indicate correlation between Ulysses' episodes and parts of Odysseus' journey. Nevertheless, his work has been met with immense criticism, as well as some ambivalence as to how one should approach it. Terry Eagleton has christened the book an anti-novel, and another scholar, Robert E. Kuhn, calls its protagonist, Leopold Bloom, audaciously anti-heroic. In these reactions of apparent discomfort but unwillingness to write off the book altogether, a tone of pitying compromise seems to creep into criticisms that refuse to widen the definition of novel to accept Ulysses and the definition of hero to accept Leopold Bloom. Indeed, Joyce has not given his protagonist characteristics that make him easy to admire or even accept as a parallel to the archetypal Odysseus. With instances of uncouth behavior likely outnumbering those of valor or virtue, Bloom is no one's ideal hero, yet neither is he a satisfyingly immoral anti-hero. In the creation of Ulysses, and particularly the invention of Leopold Bloom, Joyce demonstrates his commitment to Ezra Pound's modernist maxim, make it new. Leopold Bloom is a new hero, one crafted with an uncompromising commitment to authenticity and possessing a heroism defined by those internal motivations and impulses only revealed through Joyce's delicate narrative style. The plot of Ulysses basically follows the commonplace activity of one wandering Jew, Leopold Bloom, in a single day, June 16, 1904. Throughout our time with Bloom, the reader is educated regarding his personal tastes and distastes, his sometimes obscene habits, and the deteriorated state of almost every one of his relationships. Both within and outside of his fictional world, Bloom has been accused of flaws that find root in rather controversial subject matter, most specifically morality and sexuality. What kind of hero is, as Kuhn describes, fumbling, guilt-ridden, and lonely? What kind of hero can passively tolerate his wife's infidelity as well as expose his own degenerate carnality? The answer is a new hero, a human hero borrowed from the real world instead of from the idealistic literary one. Bloom himself is a hero partly because his creation and existence in the literary realm are heroic occurrences. Before he created the final draft of Leopold Bloom, Joyce grappled with early forms and ideas that would contribute to this unique character. Initially, Bloom's peripatetic day in Dublin was meant to be a short story in Joyce's Dubliners, but Joyce ostensibly saw value in allowing the character of Bloom to marinate with other ideas and influences until he eventually appeared in Ulysses. Modeled after Joyce's friend and fellow writer Italo Svevo, Bloom possesses a demeanor of worldliness and objective maturity that, paired with the one-dimensional lasciviousness of his thoughts, has a distinct sense of being cultivated in the real world. In the opinion of one scholar, Michael Mason, Joyce was seeking fidelity to life before fidelity to other art. While most readers consider Bloom's thoughts and behavior in Ulysses excessively sexual in a sort of traditional sense, the hero of Ulysses is subject to various and repeated accusations of homosexuality by his peers. His attentiveness to his surroundings and his mild critiques do seem somewhat feminine in comparison to most of the pub-going Dublin men. But these attributes primarily emphasize Bloom's role as an outsider more than indicate anything about his sexuality. At one point, Bloom orders a gorgonzola cheese sandwich and a glass of Burgundy at a pub, while most of his peers are almost always featured ordering the wine of the country, which was beer. In the Cyclops episode, when Bloom is engaged in conversation with a nationalistic, xenophobic man who basically represents a concentrated version of all the men's opinion of Bloom, this citizen attempts to accuse the hero of being a pithogue, meaning to call him effeminate, but instead accidentally says pishogue, which instead refers to magic or witchcraft. This mistake emphasizes the citizen's rather uninformed hubristic opinion, but it also grants Bloom a rather appropriate compliment. While he never performs any particular acts of sorcery, Bloom's presence is so perturbing to his peers that he might as well be a witch. By creating Bloom as an outsider through rejection by his peers and general social displacement, Joyce has not committed decisions that disqualify Bloom as a hero, but rather that more firmly establish him as one. Just as Odysseus of Homer's epic is a traveler, Bloom's ancestors have traveled racially, and he is a product of mixed racial and religious ancestry. Additionally, Bloom displays an interest in the world and an open-mindedness that allowed by the absence of a strict nationalism. Bloom's rejection also stages him as a Christ figure, with various scenes depicting him as a holy individual. When the citizen rants with overwhelming prejudice towards anything non-Irish, seemingly without realizing, Bloom paraphrases Jesus Christ, saying, "Some people can see the mote in others' eyes, but can't see the beam in their own." Eventually, when Bloom flees the pub for literally being persecuted for his Jewish heritage, the language shifts entirely to describe him and his car as if he is the prophet Elijah ascending to heaven. Like Christ, Bloom is despised and rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Unlike the men with which Bloom attends Patty Dingham's funeral, Bloom has personally known loss as well as suffered the social stigmas inflicted by those losses. Bloom associates this infant death of his son Rudy with the loss of his husbandly and fatherly masculinity, and his community associates his father's suicide with shame and cowardice that then transfers to Bloom. Particular scenes that highlight our hero's rejection are constructed with an admirable and even sobering realism. When he expresses that the best death is dying in sleep, as it is without suffering, the Catholic Dubliners fall silent with judgment for his praise of what they consider a shameful and unblessed death, but the Jewish Bloom misses this significance. In a letter to his brother Stanislaus, dated November 13th, 1906, Joyce writes about his distaste for the lack of realism in literature, complaining that his contemporaries had a tendency to romanticize the world around them. He writes, "My opinion is that if I put down a bucket into my own soul's, sexual department, I'd draw up Griffiths and Ibsens and Skeffingtons and Bernard Vaughns and St. Aloysiuses and Shelley's and Renan's water along with my own. And I am going to do that in my novel, Inter alia, and plank the bucket down before the shades and the substances above mentioned to see how they like it. And if they don't like it, I can't help them. I am nauseated by their lying drivel about pure men and pure women and spiritual love and love forever. Blatant lying in the face of truth." In Ulysses, Joyce follows through on his promise to plank down a bucket of sexual candor and embarks on this mission most effectively through the stream of consciousness narrative of Leopold Bloom. Exposing his readers to everything from Bloom's most intrusive assessment of women's bodies to his most personal memories of loss, to his opinions about food and drink, Joyce constructs an unnervingly accurate mental schema of a singular modern man. His readers are allowed to learn about Bloom's wife Molly's infidelity, his son's infant death, and later even Bloom's most private self-criticisms and desires. Joyce refuses then to allow us to look away when our hero embarks on other traditionally private ventures, such as using the bathroom, entertaining pedestrian or immature ideas, and even participating in explicit public sex acts. By removing the wall of consciousness between Bloom and the readers, Joyce configures a new way to meet this hero. This is a way without traditional introduction or objective background. Our knowledge of Bloom instead depends on essential information regarding his past and present life, bleeding into his cognizance along with his regular thoughts. This method of narrative is, of course, also why Ulysses can be tremendously challenging to read. Joyce repeats this intrusion of consciousness from character to character, though most of our time is spent with or around Bloom. Part 2 of Ulysses, which starts with episode 4, or Calypso, begins in this way. Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. He liked thick giblet soup, nutty gizzards, a stuffed roast heart, liver slices fried with crust crumbs, fried hen cod's roes. Most of all, he liked grilled mutton kidneys, which gave to his palate a fine tang of faintly scented urine. While the perspective of this assessment is technically objective, it is obvious in this instance, as in many others in the book, that the reader is hearing Bloom's own thoughts. He is an opinionated, careful, and eloquent man, but Joyce refuses to spare us from his menial and unrefined thoughts. Ezra Pound, who did Joyce the favor of arranging to serialize Ulysses, begged his friend to remove some of the scatological references in it. At the end of the Calypso episode, wherein Bloom uses the outhouse, his thoughts about a newspaper article he is reading are interrupted by his thoughts about his bowel movements. After reading his draft, Pound wrote to Joyce, "The contrast between Bloom's interior poetry and his outward surroundings is excellent, but it will come up without such detailed treatment of the dropping feces." Joyce refused, however, to remove this and other somewhat awkward or unnecessary anecdotes, not because they contribute to Bloom's heroic character development in a traditional sense, but because they make Bloom feel like a real character. With that in mind, when Bloom performs or thinks about various indecencies or immoralities, a conscientious reader has the task of balancing this information with that provided by the opposing, yet often seemingly inconsequential instances of morality and virtue. Because Ulysses occurs in the single, rather eventful day of June 16, 1904, Bloom must be understood as a hero of potential rather than one of action. One of the most unnerving leitmotifs at work in Ulysses is the simultaneous existence of both Molly and Leopold Bloom's infidelity. While Molly's adultery manifests literally in sex with Blaise's Boylan, Bloom's is revealed through his internal preoccupation with other women and his obscene act of sexuality at the park in the infamous Nausicaa episode. Initially, most readers are repelled by Bloom's promiscuous pen pal correspondence with Martha Clifford, his leering at women on the street, and of course, his act of public masturbation. But his excessive and misplaced sexuality is not simply a product of unbridled passion. Once it is revealed that Bloom and his wife have not had a sexual connection after the loss of their son 11 years prior, it slowly becomes evident that Bloom's excessive sexuality comes from a desire to seek compensation and validation of his virility. Though Bloom does commit a social and moral offense while watching Gertie McDowell at the park, this act, along with his various mental sexual exploits throughout the day, seem to fall short of the intimate and real fantasies of his wife, Molly. Knowing that she will meet with her lover at 4 p.m., Bloom is tortured by the thought of their rendezvous all day, yet does nothing to stop it. When Molly's lover, Boylan, first appears in a scene with Bloom, Joyce is purposeful in contrasting their descriptions. While Boylan is hailed as a conquering hero, with the implication of his having sexually conquered Molly, Bloom is described as the unconquered hero. For he is not destroyed by his life's many unfortunate circumstances, even his wife's infidelity. While passivity is not a characteristic traditionally associated with heroism, Bloom's latent power suggests his resilience in all circumstances. With that in mind, the complicated, damaged marriage of the hero of Ulysses does not seem unsalvageable. Molly's powerful stream of consciousness soliloquy at the end of the novel reveals her heart is still faithful to her husband, and her soporific consciousness still returns to the memory of his proposal with affection and not regret. By allowing Molly to have the last words in this novel, Joyce again makes an unconventional stylistic move. Her emotional yet sincere mental jargon nods to the sentimental nature of her husband's heroism as her thoughts read. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes, and then he asked me, would I yes to say yes, my mountain flower, and first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes, and his heart was going like mad, and yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. Joyce once told a friend, one of the things I could never get accustomed to in my youth was the difference I found between life and literature. In creating Ulysses, and particularly in making its hero, Joyce demands his readers widen their scope of literary assessment to accept that which so duly belongs in that realm already, modern life. As T.S. Eliot writes, Ulysses is a step toward making the modern world possible for art. Bloom is undoubtedly human, at times inadmissibly vulgar, yet Joyce created him to break convention and to insult our critical expectations. While Bloom is not a man of acts of valor, somehow he is an iconic one and a significant one, even to the unfaithful Molly, whose last words we can borrow to answer the question, is Leopold Bloom a hero? Yes.
We have time for maybe one or two questions for her.
What would you say when comparing past heroic characters to Leopold Bloom? Would you say, is there more purpose to having an idealized hero? Or is there a point where having a very realistic hero where he actually doesn't do something that we can emulate? Is there a point where it loses its significance? Because I'm just wondering, is his point to emphasize just like a stale monotony, because if Leopold Bloom is a hero, then we're supposed to do what Leopold Bloom does. Do you think that was his James Joyce's intention?
Sure. So your question is kind of regarding the shift of, or Joyce's intent sort of to shift the idea of a hero from someone we should emulate to someone that kind of, well, and this is sort of answering your question too, that I think Joyce's intention was really to create a hero that more appropriately or realistically represents a modern man, and in his relationship, or in the interactions that we see Bloom have with his peers, we see that he is, in comparison, as admirable as Joyce really gives us. And so in this case, he is our hero, and he's kind of like the best that we're gonna get, I think. Thank you.